Okay, we're going to start. Good evening. Tonight you're at the lecture series, which is about the Orthodox Jews in Galicia. The actual title of the series is "The Struggle to Survive and Thrive Under Relentless Pressure: The Orthodox Jews in Galicia in the Modern Era, 1772, 1942." Tonight is the sixth lecture and the final one, 6 out of 6, which is in a certain way like an addendum, a postscript, a postmortem even. And I entitled it Agudah Mizrachi, the First World War and the Second Polish Republic. As you can see, tonight's lecture is being sponsored by the Gnuts. Dr. Gnut is here because they have Galiciana roots. This is in memory of Herzl Teidelman, Naftali Herz ben Mordechai Zal, who was a first cousin to Alan's mother, who was a native of Galicia and a survivor of World War II. And there aren't that many of those. That's one of the points. There aren't so many people, I'm sorry to say, who are natives of Galicia and survived World War II. That's part of what we're going to look at tonight. So without any further ado, we'll get down to work. Tonight, in the final lecture, we look at the decline and fall of Galicia and its Jews. After all, the years 1914 to 1944 or 45, I think everybody would agree, are the 30 worst years in Jewish history. Agreed? Yeah. 1914, if you're talking about how many people got killed, you understand? Now, that's the wrong, now if you're in this country, that's one thing, but I'm talking about if you're over there. Warts and all, Galicia under Austrian rule, as we saw, had enjoyed a century of peace. And peace is a great blessing, right? This all came to an end with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, which was basically, unfortunately, the fatal error in judgment of the Emperor Franz Joseph, because he started it, okay? Now, the guy was 84 years old, you understand? And he allowed himself to be pushed. Let's go to the next one. As everybody knows, I'm pretty sure you learned in school, that the whole thing was triggered off by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And that's something we all did in high school. However, that's just the beginning of the story. And that happened in June. Over the next month, and there are books and movies about this galore, they had to decide what we're going to do about it. Now, Austria said to the Serbians that the guy who shot the Archduke, which was the crown prince, was a Serbian, which was true. And therefore, Serbia was behind the assassination. At that point, all of Europe ganged up on Serbia and says, how can you be shooting, other things? And Serbia said, we didn't do it, but we're willing to make amends, and we're willing to more or less do whatever you think we should do to try to demonstrate that we didn't want this to happen, and so on and so forth. At that point, the Austrians should have said like this, okay, pay a penalty and do a this and do a that. But the emperor was 84 years old, and he was pushed by his general on the right side, Conrad von Hotzendorf, who was a fire breather. He said, no, we have to have a preventative war with Serbia. We've been waiting this for a long time. Now's the chance to do it. So don't accept any of their apologies. Don't accept any mediation. Declare war on Serbia and wipe them out. And we can do it. Now, he was full of it. It's unfortunate, you understand? He was a terrible military leader. And he had been advocating having a war like this for years. But when the emperor was a little younger and wiser, he was able to keep saying no, no, no. He finally got tired of saying no, no, no. A guy keeps telling yes, yes, yes. Eventually saying no, no, no. And so he declared war on Serbia. That set off the whole business because Serbia was allied with Russia. So Russia got in. Germany was allied with Austria. So Germany got in to help Austria against Russia. France got in to help Russia against Germany. England got in like that. Next thing you know, the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. So it's one of the most remarkably effective acts of terrorism ever. That when he assassinated the Archduke, he managed to turn the whole world upside down. And by the time it's over, and millions and tens of millions were killed, uprooted, and destroyed, Serbia got what it wanted. So basically, you could say that the act of terrorism was working, you see? Now, the whole thing happened because he got the backing I mean, Franz Josef would never go and declare war on Serbia and worry about Russia unless Germany backed him. Let's go to the next one. As you can see over there, there's Austria. But look, it's bordering on Russia. Ain't no way that Austria could ever take on Russia. No country could take on Russia by itself. The result is what we call World War I. Now, it turned out, this is the sad part. The Austrian army turned out to be very poorly led. They're a bunch of boobs. They couldn't even beat Serbia. Look how big they are compared to Serbia. They could not beat Serbia. And they certainly couldn't take on Russia. And so the result was disastrous for Galicia, as we shall see. They were greatly humiliated by the fact they couldn't defeat Serbia. The Austrian army was not in good shape. Certainly not to take on the Russians. Recklessly, fecklessly, Franz Josef and his guys violated the iron rule of Austrian diplomacy, which was never to go to war against Russia or England. That had always been a basic rule, which I think is a good idea, right? Like in America, we've had a rule, don't start a nuclear war. There's certain basic things out there. And he just did it, okay? It happened. So what it meant was that a great war would rage in the east between the Germans and the Austrians on the one side and the Russians on the other side, which means this whole area that I'm pointing to right now, not Germany, right there would be a big war zone, and that's called Galicia. So if you want to know which was the battlefield, half the battlefield in World War I in the Eastern Front, it was Galicia. And that's where the fighting was. Now, you understand, I'm talking about World War I, remember the movies, All Quiet on the Western Front, this time? You have a zillion soldiers charging this way, a zillion soldiers that way, everybody's dropping bombs, poison gas, who knows what. If you're in the middle, it doesn't matter who wins because you're dead anyway. You understand? It was just devastating. I repeat, they had had at least 100 years of peace. You know, the Austrians are better, the Austrians are worse. There have been no wars. That's very, very important, you see? And now all that turned upside down. And so the result was that already in 1914, let's go to the next one. Already in 1914, the Russian army busted in and basically had a bunch of big battles with the Austrians, and they conquered eastern Galicia. They tried to bust into western Galicia, got part of the way, but not all the way. But right away in 1914, they captured eventually Lemberg and Przemysl and this and that and the other. Gigantic battles were fought. When I say millions were killed and wounded, that's not an exaggeration. You know, the scale of battle was just incredible in places that there hadn't been a war forever, you see? And so the World War I was a disaster, as you see over here. The Austrians overran eastern Galicia, and the Russians did. This is the Tsarist Russian army, Nicholas II, right, Nicholas Alexandra. They behaved to the Jews maybe 1 degree or 2 degrees better than Hitler. That's all. So basically, the Russians went from town to town, and there were always Jews there, and when they basically killed all the Jews they could find, and they raped all the women. That's what it boils down to. You understand? That's what it was. I mean, town after town after town, city after city after city. And it was just horrible. You understand? And, you know, the Russians, there's no such thing as a trial. And I bet you if I would have said this a year or two ago, some people in the audience, certainly in the YouTube listening audience, would say, well, Kat's exaggerating, you know. He likes to get passionate about all this kind of stuff. Today, you're looking at Putin, you see it's happening again. You understand? So nobody would even question the veracity of what I'm talking about, because that's how the Russians do business. The only difference is, ain't no Jews there. Now, it's got Israel. All the old Jews are killed from before, so they're doing it to the Ukrainians. You understand? By and large. But at that time, all of Galicia was thick with Jews. Now, mind you, the Russians even did atrocities to Jews on their own side of the border. But I'm not talking about that. I spoke about it a couple years ago when we did a series about Orthodox Jews in World War I in general, if you remember. But here I'm speaking specifically about Galicia. And what I'm telling you is that eastern Galicia, pretty much the whole doggone thing was overrun by the Ruskies in September, October, November, December of 1914. And Austria was on the ropes. In fact, in a regular war, they just would have surrendered and lost the whole Galicia, who knows what. But World War I was so nationalistic that each side wanted to wipe out the other side. Now, therefore, I'm describing a situation that hadn't been seen since the Gezeres Tachvatat of Khmelnytsky back in the 1640s, when the Slavs, in that case the Ukrainians, came and killed all the men and raped all the women and this, all this, same business. You understand? But this was 1914. What I'm just telling you is one of the main reasons the United States of America could not get into World War I during the first term of Woodrow Wilson, even though there were a lot of people in this country, you're rich and powerful, led by Teddy Roosevelt, they said we should get in. But even Teddy Roosevelt said like this, I can't say America should join the same side as Russia. You see? It was the British, the French, the Russians, versus the Germans and the Austrians. Now, as far as the Jews are concerned, in that part of the world, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? The Germans and the Austrians are the good guys. The Russians are the bad guys. It was only at the beginning of Wilson's second term when 1 month before, in fact, the same time as Wilson's beginning second term, that's when you had a Russian Revolution. The Tsar was overthrown. Russia became a democracy. That was giving a hechsher. Now it has the Starcade. So then we could go into war. That's a major element. Let me also say, I didn't write down here, that this created a general crisis. In this series, I'm talking about Galicia. But the same thing happened in Poland, Lithuania, and the other areas where the fighting was going on. And you had mass starvation and suffering and malnutrition and who the heck knows what. And you had the same thing in Belgium. And a guy named Herbert Hoover organized a big Galicia operation to provide food and prevent starvation in Belgium. And so the Jews, they said, we should do the same thing. And that's how you got the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC. Because first the Frum started it, what they call the Central Relief, and then the labor union, the Jewish labor unions, and then the rich guys, they all got together and said like this, we got to do something to help the Jews over there because they're all going to die from the starvation and from the lack of medicine and that kind of stuff. And the U.S. Jews really stepped up to the plate. Remember, at that time, everybody in this country almost had relatives back in the old country, right? How many Jews in America had relatives, in 1914, had relatives in Poland, in Galicia, in Lithuania, and places? Everybody. Yeah, I mean, the great majority. And so when you said people would come to shuls and they would rent out public halls, Carnegie Hall and things like that, Madison Square Garden, the equivalent of that, and they would give speeches and they say, listen, I don't have to tell you, your own Bubby and Zeta, your parents, your brothers, your sisters are starving over there unless we step up and do something because you can't expect anybody else. Women gave their wedding rings because then people brought their bonds. They did it because it was a life and death situation. So all of a sudden, the good old Galicia that I described until now, in which the biggest problem was rigged elections or stuff like that, now turned into serious bad news. The Russians basically made a churban wherever they went. And as they said, nothing like this had happened to Galician Jewry since Khmelnytsky. In the 1700s, in the 1800s, nothing, that kind of violence had never happened. Imagine the panic that hit the Jews. If you knew it was good for you, as soon as the war broke out, if you could, you ran away. You understand? The roads were clogged. All the Hasidic rebbes Belz was overrun by the Russians. Shortcut was overrun by, so all the rebbes and all the other people who can, sauve qui peut, as the French say, save yourself if you can. And all the Hasidic courts and whatever took off, and it was a vast flight of lots of Jews. And remember, Galicia had 900,000 Jews total. So I would imagine Eastern Galicia is something like 500,000. So imagine from a population of 500,000 Jews, I don't know how many ran away, but a lot. Where did they go to? Back into the Austrian Empire. So a ton of Jews crossed over the Carpathians into Hungary, and that's where they spent the war. Let's say, for example, in Budapest. A ton of Jews moved to Vienna, which was the capital city. The Associated Jewish Charities of Vienna really had a task on its hands, 1914, 1918, just to provide basic services for the mass of refugees. Many went to Prague and places like that. And that is the basic story of Habsburg Jewry, 1914, 1918. Now, I want to emphasize, the enemy never penetrated into the Austrian Empire other than Galicia. But in Galicia, they sure as heck penetrated. You see? So if you lived a little bit in Bukovina, I see it's here. There was, in 1916, there was an invasion into Bukovina. But overall, if you lived in Hungary and these kind of places, they never got that far, right, the enemy. Now, imagine the panic, imagine the flight. Hundreds of thousands flee, as I just described. By the way, this ended up with certain, if you know anything about European culture and Jewish literature, non-Jewish literature, ended up in piquant situations. Because if you know Kafka, there's a famous writer, Kafka became interested in Judaism and got this close to becoming religious. Because this guy over here, George Langer, Jiri Langer, was a boyfriend of Kafka's. They grew up together. Middle-class Prague family, Jewish family. Completely devoid of anything Jewish, because by that time, as we did on our trip, remember, Prague had sort of like dissipated in terms of its Jewish knowledge. But this guy, for some reason, got the itch to find out more about Judaism, which was extremely unusual. You know what I'm saying? There weren't Bali Tshuva, as we called this time. And it's not like he went to Frankfurt and became religious and, all right, there's a Western. He went to 1913, just before the First World War. In 1913, he traveled all the way to Galicia to Belz. So even though it's all part of the Austrian Empire, it's going to the moon as far as his family is concerned. He came back with payas and things like that. They thought, you've got to put him in an asylum, right? And came World War I. The authorities in Prague said, I guess, he's so nuts, he can't even be drafted in the army unless he's about to war. All that outlandish stuff. And now, if he would have been in Galicia, he would be drafted, but not in Prague. And these two guys hung around the Belzer Rebbe, who ran away to Bohemia, Prague and Marienbad during the years of the war. And Kafka has a whole long correspondence with Langer. I saw the Rebbe today, and they had some people came over here, and he inspected the grounds of the spa, like an archduke asking those questions, like the Queen of England does when you walk around that way. And it's very, very interesting. And he asks him, what is Havdalah? What is Kiddush? It never quite clicked. Now, there is a Baltimore connection. When this guy came in 1913 to Belz, dressed in a Western outfit, that didn't happen. He looked like a weirdo. But the guy said, I want to find out about real Judaism. And so the Belzer Rebbe, at that time, assigned one of the Hasidim to introduce him, to Hasidic Yiddishkeit. That was Rabbi Herzberg when he was very young. This is interesting. Now, as I said, the Russians overran eastern Galicia, and they got up into the Hungarian border, which means they got to the Carpathian Mountains, just south of that is Hungary, the whole wide Hungarian plain. My goodness, can you imagine if the Russians busted into that? There, the Austrians stopped them at least temporarily, because they held the mountain passes, and that was like a natural defense. That is the story of 1914. At that point, you might say, Austria-Hungary was totally defeated. It was a bitter reckoning for the Emperor Franz Joseph, who's now 84, 85. What a mistake he had made. Understand? He had been led to believe by his general that they could win. It was the opposite. The Russians were now looking to conquer Western Galicia. Makes sense, right? No Carpathian Mountains. You just go this way. So into Sons, into Chebin, eventually to Krakow, that way. Okay? And that, incidentally, there were heavy battles, therefore, very heavy battles, in the middle of Galicia. If anybody, not that I would expect you to notice, but there was this long series of sieges of Przemysl, which are very famous because that was the main Austrian fortress. And they kept attacking it and being repelled until they finally won, the Russians. And then they had a good headway into Western Galicia. That is when Sarah Schneer and her family ran away because they were from Krakow. So they're really far away from that. They're on the end of Western Galicia. But it looked at one point like the Russians are going to come in. And so anybody with sense, that's how she fled to Vienna and spent these years over there. Now, in the end, the thing turned around. In the spring of 1915, the next spring, Austria-Hungary was saved by the Germans, by their allies. Okay? What happened was in World War I, the Germans did not have the best generals on the Western Front, but they did have the best generals on the Eastern Front. This is Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and Mackensen. The three famous names of 100 years ago. And they, little by little, a lot of casualties, they crushed the Russians. I'm not going to go through the whole business, but suffice it to say that there was a very famous thing, if you're World War I knowledgeable at all, it's called the Tarnów-Gorlitz offensive. So Tarnów and Gorlitz in the middle of Galicia, the two Jewish towns, two Jewish cities. And Mackensen saw there's a little hole in the Russian line, and they busted through, and they turned the Russian thing all around, and they reconquered all of Galicia and central Poland. Okay? They were on a roll. And after that, the Russians were in Agudah. And in the rest of 1915 and 1916, the Germans made steady progress east, until Russia surrendered in 1918, beginning of 18. So this obviously turned things around for the Galician Jews. Well, so many returned in the spring of 1915 because the good guys are back. May I say that we'll see a little bit later that there were 350,000 Jews in Franz Josef's army. And a lot of them were Hasidim from Galicia. It's hard for people to believe today. The people in the army would pay us and things, and in the Austrian army, if you had religious reasons, you could do it. You understand? And they were very respectful for the Jewish customs. And if you had 100 soldiers who requested in a unit, the army would provide you with a kosher kitchen. So it's really interesting how that worked out. As far as I know, this is the only war that Hasidim participated. They were drafted, but they went voluntarily, and a lot of them won medals. There was some story. What's her name? Marsha Rosenblatt at College Park has a book about this. I forget, it was some story where a guy was davening, and all of a sudden the Russians attacked, and they made a counteroffensive. He charged in battle, still wearing his tefillin, and he won some kind of medal. You understand? So it's very unusual, and as many of you know, Rabbi Herzberg was in the Austro-Hungarian army. In fact, he was a casualty of the Austro-Hungarian army because a bombshell hit right next to him, and for the rest of his life he had that tremor. You understand? Like that. So this is, all of a sudden, Galicia turned from the relative paradise, warts and all, that I've been describing before. The peace is no small thing to the opposite, okay? The opposite. Now, as a result, let's go to the next one. The Germans, as I said, little by little, this is the modern map, but the territories that I'm pointing to, Ukraine, Belarus, all, is the old Kingdom of Poland, right? The Russians annexed it, but it's the old Kingdom of Poland. In the course of 1915, 16, 17, the Germans conquered all this stuff, everything you see here. Lithuania, Austria, Estonia, they conquered Belarus, they basically conquered Ukraine, up to Russia proper. And then by that time, Lenin had taken over Russia, and he made a peace with them to stop right there. Okay? So, as far as Galicia is concerned, the Russians were pushed out, except on one occasion, when they had what they called the Brusilov offensive, which again is very famous, and the Russians launched a very successful attack. Then they're back into East Galicia, and they're back, and this time they're into Bukovina as well. So then the Jews once again got a collective heart attack, but within a short time, they were pushed back. This is what I just told you was the war how it affected in Galicia. So they never did get into Krakow and those kind of places, but there were huge battles and a lot of dead people and a lot of suffering going on and displacement during these years, all right? I mean, you have to understand, the Austro-Hungarian army lost millions of casualties because they didn't fight well. In other words, the generals screwed up, you see? And Franz Josef himself ended up dying in right in the middle of the war at the age of 86. Here's his famous funeral. All the princes of Germany who were on the side of the Central Powers, you can see some Turks, and feel like they all went to the big funeral, and everybody could already smell it don't look too good for Austria-Hungary. You know what I'm saying? In other words, however the fighting turns out, the old man was like the symbol of an era, and the symbol of the empire, and he was succeeded by his great nephew, Charles Karl, who was a nice guy and was okay with the Jews and all that. But like I said before, you could already see it's 2 minutes before 12, as they say. And many have written about the fact that they call this the funeral for an empire, not a funeral for an emperor. You see? But to be fair, the war went on for another 2 years. Right? Another 2 years. Now, as I said, where is it? Yeah, here we go. 350,000 soldiers were in the Austro-Hungarian army, and they were well treated. Some of them could even become generals, which is unthinkable in the German army. Now, I'll tell you, by that point, he had a very liberal operation going on as far as the Jews are concerned. And I found a 60 Minutes piece, sounds like morally safer of them, that they did a number of years ago on the Jews in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's a 2-3 minute piece, and I'm going to show you right now. And one of the points he says is true, which is, by the time we're talking about, the Jews were a pillar of the regime. You get it? Who could the Emperor Francis rely on? You got your army, you got your civil service, you got this, you got the Jews. Because wherever the Jews were, this is as good as it's going to get. If Austria falls apart, it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And that's going to be the story in Galicia in particular, as we saw. So let's take a look at this.
You're listening to one of the most stirring pieces of military music, the Radetzky March. It was played by the military bands of the Austro-Hungarian army since Johann Strauss composed it in 1848 until the empire collapsed in 1918. You might well ask, what has this to do with Jewish history? The answer may surprise you, because by and large, Jews throughout the old empire held its emperor, Franz Joseph, in especially high regard. He ruled from 1848 until 1916, a total of 68 years. That meant entire generations grew up and knew no other emperor. Some thought both the emperor and his empire would last forever. Look at this Hebrew prayer book. Jews throughout the empire prayed for the emperor's health. They had good reason. During Franz Joseph's reign, Jews had come out of the ghetto and into society. They not only were able to attend universities, they taught in them. They played in symphony orchestras and conducted them. They worked in retail trades and as doctors and lawyers. From his side, the emperor knew he could depend on 4 groups to support his vast multi-ethnic empire: his civil servants, the aristocracy, the Jews, and the Austro-Hungarian army. Just as important, Jews throughout the Danube monarchy, as it was called, knew that as long as the empire held together, nationalism would be kept at bay, because the byword of the empire was tolerance. It didn't always work, but the intent was to maintain a common home, a common ground. That meant living in what is now Ukraine and Poland, in what is now Hungary and Romania, in today's Austria and Croatia. Jews were, and Jewish soldiers perhaps even more so, some of the emperor's most loyal subjects. But this brief golden age was soon to end. By the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, a wave of nationalism was sweeping Europe, and the empire itself would soon be torn apart. So in its last days, and even in the carnage of the First World War, many of the empire's Jews hoped and prayed that the empire might survive, not because they were monarchists, but for the very practical reason, survival. They feared whatever would come after it would be much worse. And as we all know, they were right.
Yeah, so that pretty much sums up what we've been talking about, right? Now, in a quickie way. So I repeat, there were lots of Hasidic soldiers, other religious soldiers. There were plenty of Jewish soldiers that weren't religious, you could do whatever you wanted. And, to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this did not happen in Germany. Germany is a Christian unit. They just have rights for the Jews. They're held at a distance. Austria was more close and personal. Every Christmas, the Catholic and the Protestant soldiers got some kind of a Christmas present, whatever it's from the emperor, maybe a cross or something like that. And every Hanukkah, all the Jewish soldiers in the army got a tallis, because he was told that's important to them. You see? So, and you could have a Seder and all this other kind of stuff. It's very interesting, and people don't realize this. Now, as a result, let me say this. The First World War is pretty much the only time in history when you had mass numbers of Jews fighting and killing each other. Before the First World War, certainly before the 19th century, Jews were just not drafted. That's the old system. Now that changed. Once they got citizenship, they got into conscription. But there were no big wars until the First World War. And by that time, the Jews were expected to be nationally patriotic. And as a result, take, for example, what I'm talking about, the Galician front. On one side, you have the Austro-Hungarian army with 250,000 Jews. And the other side, you have the Tsarist Russian army, who also drafted a heck of a lot of Jews, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. The difference is, how you were treated. There's a very famous story that when the war started, a bunch of rabbis from Hungary came to see Franz Josef and said, "We want you to know we are praying for you to win." And he said, he was already old man, he said, "Listen, let's cut the baloney. You and I both know that at this very moment in St. Petersburg, a bunch of rabbis are telling the Tsar of Russia the same thing, But the chief rabbi of Budapest, Koppelreich, he said, but there's a difference. We mean it." You understand? So you had situations in which Jews are fighting and killing each other. You see? In ways that usually didn't exist. And there's many famous variations of the story. It's got to be true, because I've heard it 100 different ways, including Osher Buchwalter, that, they're fighting in the army and they're battling each other, and one's going after the other with the bayonet, and finally I win and I get the guy first. And as he's dying, he says, "Shema Yisrael." I said, "Oh, shoot." You understand? And Osher told me that he knew when he was young in Vienna, they used to visit, I guess, the hospital or something like that on the Shabbos, him and his father, and there was a guy who went nuts as a result of that experience. You understand? I remember Josh Gutman told me years ago that his father's father, right? Olman Gutman's father was in the German army in First World War fighting the French. And when they said shoot, he used to shoot up because he was afraid of hitting a French Jew. So it's a funny thing. Now, this did not happen in World War II, as we understand. By that I mean there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Allied army, especially in the Red Army and places like that. There weren't no Jews on the German side. You get it? You have no hesitation of shooting against the enemy. In World War I, you did. It's just an interesting feature. Now, if the Austro-Hungarian army had been better led, we can go into that, but they weren't. And so it wasn't the soldiers' fault. It was the top guys, and that's what happened. But then came late 1918. Now, as the war eventually ended, at least it seemed to, when Germany was bludgeoned into an armistice and the Kaiser abdicated. In other words, we know what eventually happened in World War I. The Germans were compelled. The Americans came into war, Woodrow Wilson and all that. And the Germans had to give in. And they signed an armistice. And Kaiser Wilhelm had to leave. and Germany went through a hard time. When that happened in Germany, what happened to the Austro-Hungarian Empire? It's very fascinating. A new and deadly ruach appeared and spread all throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a spontaneous ruach of disintegration. It happened real fast and with days and within weeks. The empire simply broke up. It's funny. All of a sudden, these guys say like this, we're out of here, we're not part of this. And they did, and they did, and they did, and they did, and they did. And there was nobody left. You see? It's very interesting. Now remember, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a collection of different groups. So each one made Shabbos for themselves, and the emperor, the new guy, Karl, found himself without anybody under him, and he was compelled to abdicate. And so who were the big losers as a result of the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Everybody knows there were two big losers, the Habsburgs and the Jews. It's like a famous trope of Jewish history, because the Habsburgs lost what they had, and the Jews lost what they had because it wasn't going to be good what was coming after them in most places. Okay? For our purposes, in this series, we're concentrating in Galicia, and that means you and I are interested in Poland. Okay? But herein lies the tale, because the Poles had been told by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points that Poland would be restored. I think we remember from high school that Woodrow Wilson had the 14 points. And basically he told the Germans, this is what the peace is going to be based on. One of them is that the crime of the partition of Poland in the 1700s would be undone, and that Poland would get its land back. They'd become a nation again. That's one of them. So when Germany was defeated in November of 1918, and Germany withdrew its troops back to Germany, the Poles in Poland immediately declared independence, and they declared the establishment of something brand new, what they called the Second Polish Republic. Now, the first Polish Republic was the nobles. I mean, they meant like you and I call a Polish state. And the whole world said that this was writing and historic wrong. It wasn't right that Poland had lost its national identity and been taken over by the others. It's only right the Poland should bounce back again. There was one big problem, however. No one had defined the borders of Poland. So where's that going to go? Now, if you're a Polish nationalist, you want it all. You want the old kingdom, right? So if I'm Pilsudski, I say we should go back to the old Poland. So Poland should include all of this? It used to, right? To the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, come back to mama. You understand? Well, guess what? The Poles and the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the others, they don't want any of that. You used to rule us. We weren't all part of one country. We don't want that. Okay? I mean, you can understand that. The Poles reacted like Putin. Really, you're all Polish. You're branches of the Polish nation. You do not have the right to break off and have your own independence, which is exactly what Putin is saying today to the Ukrainians. The others said to Poland, no, we ain't. We ain't no part of the Polish nation. We don't want no part of the Polish nation. That's part of our negative past. And we want to be our own country. We want a country called Lithuanian. And heck with that. We want a country called Latvia. And frankly, they wanted a country called Ukraine. They wanted a country called Belarus. That didn't happen, but nobody wanted to go back under Poland. And as a result of this disagreement, my friends, the result was that in the East, World War II lasted an extra 4 years. This is not generally so well known. I've mentioned it many times. But if you live in Eastern Europe, World War I lasted from 1914 to 1922. You get it? Because they're sorting out the new situation. And the only way you could sort it out was by force. That's what happened. So there's a whole bunch of wars that popped up. For our purposes here tonight, we want to know what happened to Galicia. Therein lies the tale. Here's where the artificiality of the concept of Galicia kicked in. As I pointed out, there always really were two separate parts of Galicia that weren't really the same. Western Galicia and Eastern. It wasn't just a geographical difference, it was ethnic. Western Galicia were all Poles. Eastern Galicia was mostly Ukrainian. Just as the Poles declared their independent state when the Germans pulled out, well, guess what? The Ukrainians did the same thing. And Warsaw and Kiev soon became Warsaw versus Kiev. Okay? Now, I'll give you a 2-minute session, not more, in the complexities of ethnicity in Galicia, because it's very complicated. Eastern Galicia, the whole province, the Ukrainians totally outnumber the Poles, 65 to 22, with the Jews in the middle. 65% of the population is Ukrainian and don't want to be Polish, 22%. But in the cities, especially the biggest city, there are more Poles. It's 60 to 17. You see how that works? With the Jews in. Now, Woodrow Wilson, you say, oh, all the nations should have national self-determination. I said, tell me how that works. So what happens to Eastern Galicia? He had no idea because he was an American guy, he just didn't know anything about Europe. Now, how would he? The unbelievable admixture of different races and groups and all this who hate each other, who have been held from making war against each other by the imperial power of Russia, Austro-Hungary, places like that, that held everybody down for their own mutual benefit. But if the big guy is removed from the scene, as the Austrian Empire just disintegrated, if it's every man for himself, which is what turned out, you're going to have a situation of terrific civil wars between whole areas of the population in which one, hates the other. So there's a big war broke out, as you see. Let's go to the next one. See, this is the Austrian province of Galicia, but really it's two. It's Western Galicia and Eastern Galicia. This is Ukrainian. The Ukrainians in Eastern Galicia proclaimed an independent state, which was called the Republic of Western Galicia, of Western Ukraine, I'm sorry. The People's Republic of Western Ukraine. Because from their perspective, the rest of the Ukraine is to the east of them. So they're in the western part of Ukraine. I hope I'm not losing you. There's a big area called Ukraine, which was always part of the Russian Empire. But this Eastern Galicia was Ukrainian. It was part of the Austrian Empire. So they had a different way. So they said, we're setting up, we're making Shabbos for ourselves. The Poles didn't like that, and the Poles attacked and conquered it in a big bloody war in 1918, 1919. I'm not going to go through the details. Okay? So it was a war in Eastern Galicia. Now, there was no war in Western Galicia. That's all Polish. So if you live, for example, in Krakow or a place like that, you've got a new country, and that's it. But if you're in Eastern Galicia, it's a war zone. Correct? And, the question is like this. Are you on Team A or Team B? Like Northern Ireland, those kind of situations. Except that the Jews in Northern Ireland are maybe 100. In Galicia, Eastern Galicia, 500,000 or whatever. And so the situation was terribly complex. Now, the Poles did a better job of mobilizing a big army. I'm not going to give you the whole story behind that. The French helped them build up a big army. And by the time it's over, the Poles were able to militarily conquer the whole place. A lot of Jews in Eastern Galicia, so basically the question goes like this. And this is the terrible problem with Gaulish. It happens again and again. You're in a country and two groups are fighting each other. Which horse do you choose? Do you choose the winning horse or do you choose the losing horse? So if you live in Eastern Galicia, most of the places outside the city, most of the people around you were Ukrainian. So you say, I'm supporting the Ukrainians. The Poles were super angry about that. How could the Jews be sympathetic to the Ukrainians? Okay? And the Polish thing goes like this. Hey, we let you into the country back in the 1500s. We were nice to you. And this is how you repay us, you see? And as we'll see in a minute, there were two types of Poles in this period. I'll call it the good ones and the bad ones. The good ones are ones led by Pilsudski, and the bad ones by Dmowski, Roman Dmowski. These are famous names in Poland. And Dmowski was very anti-Semitic. You understand? He said letting the Jews in the first place was a bad mistake. Got to get rid of the Jews. Jews are poison, they're a cancer, they're communists, this and that and the other. And so these Dmowski types launched all kind of pogroms in which people were killed and property was destroyed and maimed and raped and this and that and the other in Lemberg and a lot of other places. This is a touchy subject with the Polacks today. I mean, if you look this up online, it's one of these YouTube battles. Wikipedia battles, get it? They're going to say, it was the Jews' fault, we didn't do it. If we did it, we were justified. And the Jews say, no, it was your fault, it was not our fault, and all this kind of business. They claim the Jews started it. Of course, the Jews claim otherwise. But you started to have these pogroms. Now, it's not like Hitler. These pogroms that the Polish put, it's 100 people here, it's 100 people there. It's not the large numbers that we're thinking about with Germany in World War II. But nevertheless, this was unprecedented in Europe. The Poles hated the fact that the Jews have a lot of sympathizers in the West, because by this time, everybody had family in England and in America. And they pressured the American government to pressure Poland. They hate that. To make matters worse for the Ukrainians, the rest of the Ukraine was conquered by the ruthless Bolsheviks. In other words, the Ukrainians, and I don't blame them, had dreams of setting up their own big country called Ukraine. Well, guess what happened? They got their own partition. Lenin ended up, by the time it's all over, taking over all the part that you call Ukraine, with the exception of the Western Galicia part, which stopped calling it Eastern Galicia part, stopped calling Eastern Galicia, called Western Ukraine from their perspective. So if you're Ukrainian, they screwed them both. Part of the country was taken over by Stalin, part of the country taken by Poland. Ukraine ends up with 0. So they were a very bitter group about this. And by the way, the League of Nations promised they would fix it, and they never did, and so forth and so on. So now in the 1920s and 30s, if your parents are from there, the Poles were the satisfied ones, because by the time all the fighting was over, they got what they wanted. I'm talking about non-Polish territory. By the way, Volhynia, what somebody asked me before, was also part of this. Volhynia is part of the new Poland with a lot of Ukrainians in it. And so the Poles are dominating the Ukrainians. They won't let you talk the language. They won't let you have books. They won't let you have your own schools. You know, they'll do what they can to crush you, even though you'd say like this: why don't you have sympathy? This was done to you by the Russians, by the Austrians. But it doesn't work like that. Instead, until now they were doing it to me, but now it's my chance to do it to you. That's the mentality. Okay? So the Poles were the satisfied ones, more or less, because they got the truly Polish heartlands. I mean, Pilsudski, the Polish general who was the successful one, he wasn't satisfied because he wanted all of it. You see? And I want to say, he was a statesman, but extremely Polish, and he tried to say, listen, it's good for everybody if the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, everybody would agree to come back under the old Poland, and we'll treat you okay because we all have a common interest against Russia and Germany. And that was not wrong, but so bitter were the memories of oppression that everybody said, I guess I want to have my own country, I don't care what. Okay? So look what a messy situation happened in Galicia now that the war started and the old days were over. Now you begin to understand why people used to say, oh, before the war was great, and Franz Josef and this and the other. This is the reason, okay? Because it got a lot worse later. Now, the Ukrainians were the dissatisfied ones. They were now the old Poles. The Ukrainians now dreamt of an independent Ukraine. The Polish state repressed them as the Tsarist state had once repressed the Poles. And just as the Poles have been divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which made any hope of independence a pipe dream, now the Ukrainians were divided between Poland and the USSR. Now, really, the Ukrainians who were not in Soviet Russia should have said, woo, at least we don't got Stalin. Franz Josef, though, had been nicer to the Poles than Pilsudski was to the Ukrainians. You see, that's the thing. It's not, Poland wasn't, what's the right word, tolerant, generous, wise to the Ukrainian. I want to say the Ukrainian minority. It wasn't a minority in Eastern Galicia, it was a majority. So it was a very touchy situation, okay? And as I said, Stalin, let's go to the next one. Stalin was much worse. And the Ukrainians, let me put it this way. I think you know this, many of you. In the Ukraine that was part of the Soviet Union, Stalin made a famine and killed, like, I don't know how many, 10 million people, took all the food away from starvation. Nothing like that happened in Eastern Galicia. But that's relative terms. It's true, but they don't want to hear it. You understand? They don't want to hear it. So this is how it happened. So my point is that Eastern Galicia, or Western Ukraine if you prefer, was seething in the 1920s and 30s. Jews were living on a powder keg, and it was not a powder keg of their own making. So all of a sudden, Lemberg, if you think about it, or Lvov as they call it now, I mean, you don't know what's going tomorrow, right? You don't know what's tomorrow. I can tell you one thing. If there's a blow-up, A is going to fight B, B is going to fight A, but both of them are going to kill the Jews. You see? If there's a blow-up. And so living in Galicia in the 20s and 30s was like living on, near a sword or something, on the point of a sword. But, people didn't want to think of it that way. And now let's take a look at the Jews. As we saw, Under Austro-Hungary, they've been protected by Franz Josef. This was no longer the case. The new Polish state had the Dmowski attitudes towards the Jews. I told you, Roman Dmowski, very famous person in Poland, said, one of our number one problems is we got too many Jews. Now, he wasn't wrong. I'll tell you what I mean. The whole Poland was 31 million. The Jews were 3.3 million. And I'm not counting the Germans and the Ukrainians and all that stuff. 10% of the whole population, a big chalik of whom are Hasidic, you can't really expect the Poles to be comfortable with that. You get it? There were too many Jews. Now, ideally, they would have set up a state of Israel, and that would take care of that, and everybody would be happy. But it didn't happen in the 1920s and 30s. Believe you me, there was no country in the world which is as pro-Zionist as Poland. They said, they told Jabotinsky and the others, tell us whatever we can do to make you work, because they wanted a Jewish state, to send everybody over there. And they wouldn't have to send anybody. So many would leave on their own. You see? What do you do with all these people who are not Polish? It doesn't look like they're assimilable, especially the Hasidim and the very religious types. You can understand it's a bone in the throat. Now, Pilsudski was a higher statesman. Okay, he came from the aristocracy. He said like this, no, Poland has always had the Jews as part of the furniture. They never bothered the Polish state. They're loyal to the country if we make it good for them. And they're not Polish, okay, doesn't bother me. I mean, I'm not going to a Hasidic restaurant, Let them do their thing. And they can make a positive contribution to the whole operation. He thought that way. And as long as he was in charge, things were better for the Jews, relatively. But when he was gone, or if you ask the other side, which are called the Index, the National Democrats, the Dmowski guys, the Jews out now. Now, we have room for 10,000, 30, 40,000, all right. And if they're Polonized. But this large group over here is no good. Now, you got to understand, this was the problem, okay, with the Jews. I'll tell you again, Jabotinsky, who lived in Poland for a while and other places, he visited Poland many times, and he has a very famous essay, which I told you about yesterday, which is called The Anti-Semitism of Things. And he said, you can't blame the guy, you can't blame the Polish. Because if they make it a meritocracy, the Jews will get all the jobs, they'll get all the positions in medical school, law school, all the rest of it, because they'll ace the LSATs, and they'll ace the MCATs. They'll be ahead of most of the Poles. And they don't want a situation where all the doctors are Jewish. They don't want that. You see? 10% maybe. And even that's a lot. It's a Polish country. They want Polish people in there. You understand? All the mailmen will be Jewish. They don't want that. You see? And so the Polish government went the other direction, slowly, steadily, and then really building up a steam in the 30s, after Pilsudski died, in which they kicked the Jews out of the economy to the degree that they could. For example, it used to be a big Jewish business, I don't know, to have a bar, let's say, for example. From now on, you can only have a bar, you have a special license from the government, and you were a soldier in the Polish army in this year. Notice, you write the law in such a way, the Jews are kicked out. All of a sudden, all these people, are just gone administratively. Same thing with a kiosk. You can only have a kiosk, to sell over there if you have business credentials, which the Jews didn't have, and so on and so forth. Anybody who's in the existing civil service, see, under Franz Josef, it was a fair system. And so plenty of Jews had jobs with the railroad, which was like having jobs today, what will I say, with computers. That was a big, employer. And other areas, the post office, they got kicked out, you see? We want to replace them with Polish guys. And so it got really tough for the Jews because people lose their parnosa. And Jabotinsky said, listen, I understand them. It's not good. That's why we need a Jewish state now. That was his point. That's why he was so strong, like Menachem Begin. We need a state now because there is no future for the Jews here. You get it? Now, already in 1919, the very beginning, the anti-Semitism and the violence was there. Though they hated it, the Poles were to some extent dependent on Western goodwill and support. I mean, look at Poland. It's between Germany and Russia. They need the support of the West. By the way, in the end, it didn't help, did it? But at least they thought. Because after all, Polish expansionism had alienated all their neighbors. So every country was in border Poland that hated Poland. So then you need some support somewhere. So you're talking about England, France, America. Okay? England, France, America. Now France, because of cynical politics, was going to back Poland no matter what. That's the cynical French way. They said, we want a big, strong Poland as a buffer against this and that and the other. Old-fashioned 18th century way. But America and England was up for grabs. They were not emotionally committed to a large, remember, they're both Catholic, to a large Polish state. Okay? The Poles hated to do it, but they said, we can't do what we'd really like to do to the Jews. They had to restrain themselves in order not to over-alienate the British and the Americans, which would hurt Poland vis-a-vis its neighbors. So here you see the idea that has restrained anti-Semitism in the last 30 years, ever since communism fell, in countries that are traditionally anti-Semitic. In Poland, since 1990, in Lithuania, these places, there hasn't been anti-Semitic violence. Not because all of a sudden they've become tzaddikim, because they're smart enough to realize at this stage of the game, if we make a pogrom here, we're benefiting Putin. Didn't he invade Ukraine the other day by saying, I'm going against the Nazis and the anti-Semites? So every time the Ukrainians do something anti-Semitic, and they would like to, they realize all you're doing is helping Russia take your country. So Poland was a little bit like that in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay? The American and British Jews trusted Poland nowhere, as far as I can throw a piano. And so the American Jews especially, Americans and British Jews, send a high-level delegation to the Versailles Conference, representing American Jewry and British Jewry. Okay? And they secured the minorities treaty, which Poland had to sign under pressure. So the main American Jew at that time, Louis Marshall, head of the American Jewish Committee, he was one of the top 20 lawyers in the United States. You understand? He was a candidate for the Supreme Court. A big Reform Jew in New York. But I would say like this, a Jewish Jew, with a Jewish heart, and he was determined, using legal methods, to try to help the Jews in the new countries that are being formed in Eastern Europe, knowing full well who these guys are, what mamzerim they are. And he went over, his secretary was Felix Frankfurt, for example, and people like Benjamin V. Cohn, famous names who later on were famous in FDR's New Deal, a bunch of brains. And they went over with some high-ranking British Jews, and they went to Woodrow Wilson, all these other guys in Paris, and they said, listen, you're going to make these new countries, make them promise to have not civil rights, but minority rights. Now, what's the difference? Civil rights means we treat everybody the same. But just like we make everybody else speak Polish, you guys speak Polish too. But in these large areas, it's not fair to do that. If the majority of the population, for example, in Eastern Galicia, to give you an example, is Ukrainian, it's not fair to make them all speak Polish. And same thing with the Jews. If the language of the Jews in Poland is Yiddish, it's not fair to make them speak Polish. Poland should agree, and Romania, and Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania, and Latvia, all those new countries, that the national minorities who live in the country have a right to a minority life. Not against the country, but there should be a full cultural potential. You understand? Poland didn't want to do that. None of these countries want to do it. And none of them really kept their word, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, but at least they signed. You see? But Poland hated to do that. And Woodrow Wilson was pressured to send an investigation commission to Poland to see if the pogroms are true. This is the famous Morgenthau. In other words, the father of Roosevelt's guy. Henry Morgenthau, Sr., not the one from Roosevelt's administration. His father. He got rich, I told you the other day. He's a New York Jew. He found where they're going to make the subway lines. He bought up the property beforehand. You understand? So that's how he got rich. So I'm going to tell you something. You see this? This is a picture of Henry Morgenthau on an Armenian stamp. He's a folk hero in Armenia because he was the United States ambassador to Turkey, World War I, and he's the only one who called out to massacres against the Armenians, made a big spiel about it. Nobody else did that. You see, and he says, as a Jew, I got to do this, And so he's a hero in Armenia. He's not popular in Turkey. So Wilson sent him with a bunch of goyim, as you can see over here. Army officers and State Department types who didn't like Jews. You have to understand, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American in 1919 comes over there. He sees all these Hasidim walking around. And I want to remind you, you're thinking of Hasidim today in the United States who are middle class and prosperous. So you see a guy walking in Baltimore with a shtreimel. What does a shtreimel cost these days? I don't know, a lot of money. You know, it's a fancy business. It wasn't like that over there. There was a lot of poverty, underside. It was, you know, basically they say, I don't blame the Poles for killing them, you know, like that. And so the Morgenthau Commission issued a report. They said there were some atrocities here and there. The Polish government wasn't behind it. The Poles say it's the Jews' fault. Jews say it's the Poles' fault. The truth is somewhere in the middle. The Jews, so the Jews didn't like the report, you know. But meanwhile, Poland was given notice that, you know, you're being watched. And that's the main idea. That's the main idea. So you see how complicated life got. So for the Jews of Galicia, things now were distinctly worse. Basically, their only hope was Pilsudski. If he's on top, and it was always a fight whether he was, then he's more tolerant towards the Jews. You see? Because of Pilsudski, who actually made a coup d'etat and seized power as a dictator, a benevolent dictator in Poland in the 1920s, which the Jews were happy with. Because of Pilsudski, things were somewhat mitigated, although, you know, it didn't compare for the Galician Jews to Franz Josef. See, if you're a Polish Jew living in Warsaw, central Poland, we say, this is okay. But if he would talk to his cousin in Lemberg, he'd go, you don't know like we had it in 1914 before there. This is nothing like we had, you know, there was a Gan Eden compared to what we have now. The guy in Warsaw would say like this, it's not so bad. Yeah, you don't know. You didn't know what it was like. You see the cultural differences depending on the province and the history, okay? And so, what can I tell you? These first 15 or so years of the Second Polish Republic, I'd say 1920, 1935, were the relatively good years, as good as it could get. But there was no real future for the Jews in Poland. The Poles nationally wanted to dominate their own country, as Jabotinsky said again and again. They want a Polish Poland. That's who they are. One big difference that now emerged, that all the Polish provinces came together, was political life. In this Second Polish Republic, there was an incredible 3.3 million Jews out of 31 million total population. That's a gigantic percentage, the like of which is nowhere. I mean, that would mean you'd have 35, 40 million Jews in America, which we don't. Therefore, there arose in the 1920s and 30s in Poland a whole host of purely Jewish national parties who ran for public office in the elections. This did not happen under Franz Josef. There you had that crooked stuff that we were talking about yesterday. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, there's a national party called the Mizrachi, a national party called the Agudah, a national party called the General Zionist. There's one called the Communist Party. There's one called the Socialist Party. The Socialist this party. The Bundes is a legitimate party. The Yiddish is a legitimate party. Es hat sich gekocht, you understand, in Polish life. And this was all legal and part of the system. Okay? So therefore, let me say this. We don't have this in America. You don't have a national party, a Jewish party, right? Not running for elections in public office. It was like old Galicia, but on steroids. Now, the Hasidim, therefore, major players in the 1920s and 30s, national politics. Can you get the vote out? Can you elect your people? And can you elect your people for, head of the... There's two sets of elections. One is for public office, Polish office, like parliament, and the other one is for the local kehilas, because you still have these Jewish communities, and they raise money for Jewish causes, and in one way or another, and who gets to have the final say on how the budget is spent. And so in the 1920s and 30s, in Vilna, and Warsaw, and Lodz, and Lemberg, and who knows where, Krakow, every few years you had these Jewish elections, and let's say for argument's sake, that Krakow has 50,000 Jews. Let's say they have a Jewish budget. I'm just making this up. Let's say $10 million. That's what they raised. How's that 10 million spent? So if the Bundes win the election, and nobody ever won the whole election, 51%. If the Bundes win the election, they'll say put all the money for Bundes schools. If the Hasidim get the election, they'll put for Hasidic. If the Mizrachi went, they'll say put for Bnei Akiva. What always happened was that nobody won the whole thing. They had to make a coalition, do horse trading. This is the background for the political system of the State of Israel. It's exactly the Second Polish Republic. That is exactly what happened. And all these guys were from Poland, like Ben Gurion, Lisa Greenbaum, Moshe Shapiro, Eliezer Kaplan, all the machers of 1948. That was the system. You get it? Nobody gets all. Everybody has to break it up, and then you have to form some kind of coalition based on Tammany Hall horse trade. Okay? Now, so the Hasidim in Poland could have a block vote, and that's what they used. The non-Front parties, there are plenty of those, they pursued one kind of politics. The Front parties pursued a different kind of politics. The non-Front parties pursued a democratic, anti-Polish political policy, taking off the Poles. The main leader was Itzhak Grunbaum, who was the leader of the Zionists, the militantly secular, and others. And he said like this: we were promised in the minorities treaty so and so many rights. The Poles don't want to give it to us. That we should fight for it and ally ourselves with the other national minorities. We should form a coalition in parliament with the Ukrainians, to meet in Galicia, with the Germans, with the Lithuanians, with the Belarusians. So in other words, and we should mutually fight for our thing. So that's a straight up, classic liberal kind of approach, which enraged the Poles, because it means you're a fifth column. The Agudah, as you can understand, had a completely different policy, which was support the Poles, they're making a thing, and when you need something, talk to them behind closed doors. Cut a deal. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you something really funny if we hold on for a second. Here's the video that we all saw recently from the Chofetz Chaim from the 1923 Agudah convention. There's somebody from Hollywood happened to take part of it. You had X number of Jewish senators in the Polish Senate, as well as the parliament. The Senate was higher. That means they represent certain political parties. Well, you have your Bundes party, you got your Democratic party, you got this party, that party. You also have the Agudah. The Agudah sent these guys who are big rabbis with very long beards, and they are senators making speeches in the parliament in Warsaw. Like, for example, the representative from Galicia. Take a look at this. That's it. The guy with the long beard is the famous Rabbi Avram Tzvi Perlmutter. Now, he was one of the big senators. Believe it or not, he spoke a perfect Polish. Here he's visiting the Agudah convention of 1923. And, he was a big macher. Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who started the Daf Yomi, was a senator in Poland. You see? Now, they also had guys like Greenbaum and so forth. So I tell you, the Jewish life was very vivid, you see? But the whole Polish scene is an anti-Semitic one, okay? So this Rabbi Perlmutter, for example, was once beaten up on a train by a bunch of Shkotzim in Poland precisely because he had that long beard, you see? Now, in Galicia, in a desperate effort to somehow fit in, the Jews, all Jews, Polonized to one extent or another. The 1920s and 30s was the maximum years of Polonization. Even a lot more frum kids started going to Polish public schools of one sort or another, and not only girls, but guys. And the Jewish schools started to teach a lot of Polish subjects. And that way they hoped for better treatment from the Poles, because that was helping them against the Ukrainians. There's a classic Jewish thing, which often bites us in the face. I figure like this. Here we are in Galicia. The big problem is the Ukrainians. The Poles are a minority. If we side with the Poles and show sympathy for Poland, and we clap for the Polish flag, and we teach Polish language and not Ukrainian in schools, and things like that, then the Poles, who are a minority, will be able to say, it's not only 22% Poles, the 25% Jews or something should add it to us. They'll treat us better. That was the thinking. That didn't work, but I'm just telling you, that was the thinking. What it really ended up doing was enraging Team B, the Ukrainians. So when the Ukrainians get their chances, we all know they're going to have a lot of scores to settle, you see? But that's what happened in the 1920s and 30s. The Galician Rebbe's now, after the First World War and the upheaval, realized, unlike yesterday, you need some kind of a change, even an orthodox change. And it's really fascinating. In the 1920s and 30s, these Galician Rebbe's now set up networks of their own yeshivas. It's like a knockoff of the Lithuanian yeshiva, but it's not exactly. They're Hasidic yeshivas, which are the model for what you have in the state of Israel today. Okay? So, what's his name? The Belzers set up a network of yeshivas, especially the Bobov, if you've heard of them, and the Radomsker, and this and that and the other. No, there's a whole network of these things, and the idea was to educate thousands of kids, many hundreds certainly, in the yeshiva level. They will be the voters of tomorrow and the supporters of tomorrow. Maybe some will get rich, and so on and so forth. There's a famous article by Professor Stemper called Hasidic Yeshivas in Interwar Poland. I told you the other day they didn't do this in 1914 because we don't change. This change they implemented. Now, partially it's due to the fact, of course, that since the borders are now down, because Galicia is now an integral part of regular Poland, it's not like it's in another country as it was before the First World War when you had to cross the border into Russia. Now it's all one part of Poland. Say they were in the same country with the Litvish and the others. See, Vilna is in the same country now as Lemberg, as Lvov. And so more of a cross-fertilization of ideas. It's a fascinating phenomenon. What about education for girls? Again, this was the age of Sarah Schneer, when she started Beis Yaakov in the aftermath of the First World War. Okay? Now, she was not accepted by all. As I said yesterday, there were many Galicianer Hasidic groups in the 1920s and 30s that said Beis Yaakov is a radical left-wing idea and it's wrong, and they wouldn't let their girls go to it. They condemned it and so on and so forth, and that's what happened. But the schools, of course, did grow. It was obviously meeting a need. All across Galicia, as well as the rest of Poland, every year they started new ones. Usually they're elementary schools, sometimes they're afternoon schools, but the network and the framework was there, okay, they're filling an obvious need. So these kinds of changes kicked in. But of course, in the Sarah Schneer system, be careful not to teach too much. It's bad enough that we have to have Beis Yaakov schools in the first place. But, there shouldn't be too much. I can tell you right now, the Beis Yaakov people in the Poland 1920s would be shocked at the Beis Yaakovs today, which were really more or less taken over by the Yavna. You see? Certainly in Baltimore and I'll call it the Litvish kind of communities. And there are Beis Yaakovs, especially in Israel, with a very high level of limudim. Oh my goodness. But I'm talking about 100 years ago. It wasn't like that. The idea, Sarah Schneer said like this, he says, I want girls to feel pride and love and tremendous passion for the Yiddishkeit. And that she did do. In fact, even in Galicia, the original term Derech Eretz approach of Sarah Schneer, and that's how she started. She went to that show in Vienna as a refugee from that rabbi I showed you yesterday. She heard all those Hirschian type speeches because Rabbi Flesch was a student in the Breuer yeshiva, which was Breuer was the son of Hirsch. And therefore, you hear about the exalted position of the Jewish woman and that kind of thing, because Hirsch is unique in that, of having a very, very high opinion and always talking about of the Jewish woman, the heroine of the house. He really does. And that swept her off her feet. And originally, the Beis Yaakov was about teaching Hirschian stuff. But when she retired, which in the early 30s, she was succeeded by this guy, Rabbi Orlean, who was a Ger Chassid. And he said, okay, but we want to definitely stamp out any feelings among our students that there's something positive about getting a higher secular education, a Polish gymnasium or something like that. We're against, in other words, we're beshita, ideologically against that. And it's a terrible shame that people even look at that with any kind of envy. Now, he introduced a real Hasidic, principled anti-modern approach, as opposed to the term Derech Eretz, which was not so anti-modern at all. So, these were the trends that were sweeping through Poland and Galicia in the 1920s and 30s. Now, Sarah Schneer herself was an unusual person, And she had a unique quality. She never went to school, meaning educational school, but she had an inspirational personality, which you can't match. Some people are like that. They just have it natural. But overall, as a movement, this is the trend. By the Second Republic, meaning by the time you get to Poland in the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot more variety out there in terms of schooling, even from parents to choose if they wanted. You could go full Hasidic if that's the way to go. As I said before, all the Hasidic schools and yeshivas set up their own business. They were doing quite well. If you don't like that, there wasn't a Yavne school in Poland and Galicia. In Lithuania, by contrast, which was a separate country, the Agudah and the Mizrachi had to get along and jointly run their own school system because there wasn't enough on their own. And so they had what's called Yavne. If you'll remember, in Cleveland, there's a seminary, Yavne, right? Because Telz was where they had the seminary back in the old days. So it was more Agudah than Mizrachi, but nevertheless, there was a combined operation. And therefore, they had a much higher level of Limudei Kosher and Limudei Chol. But in Poland, not. Now, on the other hand, because what I mean is, in Poland, there was a very sharp difference between the two Jewish Orthodox groups. They really competed a lot. The Agudah on the one hand, the Mizrachi on the other. That's what happened. Now, the Agudah was not like Hungary. It wasn't like Munkacs or Satmar, where they were super, extremely anti-Zionist. They were just anti-Zionist like that. Okay. It certainly wasn't Zionist. They're against any secular kind of move. I told you yesterday, if things have been different, and if the cards have been played differently, the Chortkov and the Herzl, were close to hooking up. So, we'll never know what if. But the Polish Agudah was always more moderate, I would say, on the subject of Eretz Yisrael and Palestine. As opposed in Hungary, we had, like I said, the Munkacs and the Satmar, like, the whole thing is satanic. You see? Nevertheless, there were strong, arguments and disagreements between those two. The Mizrachi was very strong in Galicia, like other Zionist movements, for obvious reasons. What's the obvious reasons? Well, let's see. Gee whiz, what exactly is the future of Jews in this country? I just got married, and now I have a couple of kids who are going to go in first grade, second grade. What do I foresee for them in this Verstunken in Galicia another 10, 15 years from now, the way things are going? What is the future? You understand? And you all know America has a quota by now, and so forth. We can't go anywhere. The only possible way out of this junk is if we get a state of Israel of some sort or another. So therefore, anybody thinking on their feet, including very religious, tell you this, I want to get, a B'nai Akiva type thing, some Hachshara type thing, or at least get to Israel, get to Palestine. Because there, I'll live in a Jewish community, and I won't be discriminated against and persecuted for being Jewish. You can hear that, right? You can hear that. That was the attraction of the secular Zionists as well. The guy goes in Poland, like Menachem Begin, who grows up at this time and graduates college in 1935. Now, Begin got a law degree from the University of Warsaw, which is a very chashuv education in Poland. That's the equivalent of like a Harvard degree over here. By the way, Polish educational system, especially at the higher levels, was pretty impressive. Those who are real World War II nerds will recall who originally cracked the German code with the Enigma machine. Who's the first ones? Poles. Yeah. You understand? Because in Poland they had the following system. They can do this. From all over the country, who are the best kids in math? And then you put them in this school, and from them, the best kids in math. And you put them in this school, and you concentrate your brains, and then the guys that get to higher education are brainy brains, and they crack the Enigma code in the first round. You understand? So people think, Polish. It's not like that. So I'm simply saying, I'm a guy named Menachem Begin, and I'm graduating with a law degree in 1935 in Poland. What am I going to do? I'm going to spend the rest of my life as a lawyer in Poland? There's no future for Jewish lawyers in Poland. You understand? Obviously, he's going to join the Beitar and that kind of thing. In order, rak kach, we do whatever we need to do to bring in Israel now. Not that he saw Hitler. But he said, where are my children going to go? I don't want to grow up in a country that hates me and, I have to always fight against discrimination and lose, I'll go to a Jewish country. So this is the attraction of Zionism. You can understand that. Now, as I said before, that's why the Rebbe started the yeshivas and things. They said you got to do something to the situation. Maybe you spiritualize them or whatever. But in general, what's the future? Now, Beis Yaakov was an Agudah network, but I told you they went in the direction of Rabbi Orlean. The Mizrachi in the 1920s and 30s offered what you and I would call a Torah, Derech Eretz Torah Mada type approach at various levels and for both sexes, which is what many wanted. And even if they weren't necessarily emigrating in the 1920s and 30s, which was not easy, they did want a secular education in a Jewish framework. So I'll send my kids, let's say Mizrachi school, they'll get a Jewish education, they'll get a secular education, they'll know what Shabbat is, they'll think, and say, won't be the Vilna Gaon, big deal. But, they'll be Jewish, okay? Now, the Zionist parties, that I told you yesterday, certainly in the 1920s and 30s, benefited from the totalizing political party where I told you, you're Atlanta born, Atlanta bred, and when you die, Atlanta dead. You grow up if you're living in Poland, for example, 1920s, let's say you're a socialist Zionist. You're going to go to a socialist Zionist kindergarten, a socialist Zionist school, and a summer camp, and afternoon activities, and Shabbat, I didn't say from, weekend places, and picnics, and dances, and socials, and your whole life's going to be within that. And if you're lucky, one day you actually make Aliyah. But even if not, your whole life is going to be within the party. If you're Jabotinsky, it's going to be within the revisionists. If it's Mizrachi, it'll be in the Chbeis in the Beit Akiva or something like that. These are the totalizing parties which did give, the people at that time lived this experience, especially small town, a meaningful life. It gave them some content in their life. You understand? And meanwhile, you picked up a lot of education over there. You know who comes out of this environment, by the way? Kahati. It's interesting. Now, anyway, so the two trends occurred simultaneously, the Agudah trend with the yeshivas and the other trend. There was a very intensive Jewish culture going in Poland, all across the spectrum, every type of Yiddishism, Hebrewism, super secular, super Hasidic, all the way across. At the same time, a powerful Polonization process was making great strides everywhere. Just like today, outside of Kiryas Yoel, a few places like that, everybody can speak English, even if you're very religious. They're pretty doggone Americanized. Look how everybody got into the Trump thing, They're pretty Americanized in their way. So this was happening in Poland. The old cultural insularity where you only speak Yiddish, you don't know what's going on in the other thing, was really falling away, except in limited circles. That's just an interesting fact, okay? Even Hasidic schools, if you want to get a government thing, Polish government inspected, you had to teach Polish and the other secular subjects. It got harder and harder to find young people who don't read and speak Polish. And if you genuinely Polonized and assimilated, in other words, if you're willing not to be religious, you could find reception in certain Polish circles. Looks like Janusz Korczak and people like that, who were Jewish, they didn't convert, and they wouldn't deny being Jewish, but they were super Polish in their whole way of conducting themselves. And, they could get respect in some areas of Polish society. However, Rabosa, we all know, in the end, none of this mattered, did it? None of this mattered. Because it's a 20-year story, and we all know how it ends. And so that's what gives this such an unusual character. The 20s and 30s. It's like a play with 4 acts, but the 4th act takes about a second. You see? In 1935, Pilsudski, who had seized power in the 1920s, died. And he'd been good for the Jews. After that, the government was in the hands, from 1935 to 39, of strong anti-Semites. From then on, we started to really get, from the government top down, intensification of dispossession, disbarment if you're a lawyer or a doctor, displacement. They prohibited shchita. They put in Jew benches in school. You had to sit in the university in a special seat. Small pogroms. That's why the Polish government liked Jabotinsky. They said, get him out of here. Now, all this is intensified by the rise of the Third Reich at the same time, and Poland's good relations with Hitler, which was bad for the Jews. Now, Poland had a delusional foreign policy. They thought they could be friends with Hitler vis-a-vis Stalin. They didn't realize Hitler has no morals and wants to take over Poland, as you can see from the map over there, right? You know, the geography tells you everything. Poland in 1934, 5, 6, 7, 8 had good relations with Germany, and Hitler led them on. But eventually in 1939, he teamed up with Stalin to wipe out Poland. But that was the policy over there. Goebbels used to come all the time. Goering used to come all the time. And Polish were not good people. And the result was that a tremendous intensification of the already existing anti-Semitism took place inside of Poland, you see? And so it was really bad for the Jews. And all this time in Galicia, especially eastern Galicia, the Ukrainians there are seething. They built up a whole terrorist world. They created an organization called UN, O-U-N, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They have all kind of wings, many of which are dedicated to wiping out the Jews. Not all. Naturally, things being the way they are, look at that map. The UN, in other words, who's located here, have secret ties with Hitler. Right? Because the enemy of man is my friend. We both really hate Poland. So even while he's entertaining the Polish, he's in bed with the Western Ukrainians. The Western Ukrainians are fooling themselves that if Hitler wins, he will do like Napoleon. He'll bring in a free Ukraine and things like that. They didn't understand it. All during this time, tragically, there was very limited aliyah. The British wouldn't let it. To be exact, in the years 31, 35, which is just when the trouble started, there was a much bigger aliyah. Not what it needed to be. So in 31, it was like 30,000. 32 was 40-some thousand. 33, it was like 50,000. And in 34 and 35, it was 60,000. And then they stopped it, basically. And that's when you needed it, from 35 on. That's when you needed it. So you couldn't get in. You understand? With very limited exceptions. And so that's why Jabotinsky ran all over Poland with his famous speech in which he said, Polish-Ukrainian, the ground is burning under you, you better run. In other words, get into Israel any way you can. Illegally, get out of here, because I'm telling you, it ain't good for tomorrow. He was, of course, 100% right. I mean, we know this. But he was giving these speeches already in 35, 36. As Brent, you don't realize you're standing on hot fire. Get out of here while you can. Do whatever, if you can get away to Antarctica, get out of here. You see? Now, this was opposed by Ben-Gurion and company because they wanted to control the Aliyah. They said, this is illegal. They cooperated with the British in trying to stop the ships from coming to Palestine. It's an ugly episode in Jewish history, right? And it happened. What can I tell you? Then comes 1939. Now, again, I'm not spending 6 hours here tonight. Just give me the basic timeline. Then comes 1939. And, of course, the Poles are shocked when Stalin and Hitler team up to divide Poland. This is the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's Stalin shaking hands with Ribbentrop. I thought the Germans and Russians hate each other. Well, all of a sudden they decided they could do business. Here's the famous British cartoon. Scum of the working class, murder of the workers. How do you do? Because until now they're always calling each other names. When the time came to do business, they found out that they could do business. Understand? Now, specifically, why am I going into this? Because Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide Poland again, not like happened in 1772 and 1793 and so forth. Now it's 1939. How are they going to divide Poland? So the deal was like this. You, Hitler, take the Polish parts. I, Stalin, will take the non-Polish parts, including Eastern Galicia. That's my point. Okay? And Volhynia and places like that, where there's a large population of non-Poles. After all, Stalin said, I'm not raping Poland. I'm only taking the non-Polish parts occupied by the Poles after the First World War. Well, that's true. And so Stalin's going to take this over here. That's not really Polish. This is the Polish part, Krakow and all that. This part is mostly Ukrainian. And Ukraine is part of the USSR. This is what he said. Therefore, I'm not doing anything wrong. By the way, Same thing up here. I'm going to take the Belarusian part. I'm not taking the Polish part. You see? This was Stalin's argument. Look at the next slide. You see how it works out? The part that Stalin takes is not the Polish part. This is Vilna and the Lithuanian area, the Belarusian area, the Ukrainian area, what we call the Western Ukraine, which you and I used to call Galicia. See, Eastern Galicia. Okay? So now look how complicated everything is. So Galicia was divided. The eastern part would never be Polish again, Ada Yom Hazeh. This one has to be cleared. That area, down till today, has never been part of Poland again. Okay? That's why you don't say Lemberg and you don't say Lvov, you say Lviv. Now, because there's such big sympathy for the Ukrainians because of Putin, so they're trying to make everybody change all the way we speak about anything. So you can say Kiev, that's Russian, you got to say Kyiv, all this kind of stuff. But as far as we're talking about in this lecture series, the Galicianos, half of them find themselves taken over by Stalin. Okay? Now, to tell you the truth, maybe they were luckier, it's hard to tell. All the Polish officers that Stalin found here and took over when the country collapsed, he shot them. They call it Katyn. Maybe you've heard of it. They put 40,000 guys, they shot each guy in the back of the head with one bullet. After all, you don't want to waste ammo. And buried them in big landfills, things like that. Why? Stalin said like this: the Poles had no business being here. This is Ukrainian. This is Belarusian. This is Lithuanian. You see? The trouble is that now Ukraine, Western Ukraine, if you look at, is now going to be part of the Soviet Union. Okay? And that means that from October of 39 to June 20 of 41, which is about a year and a half, a little more, Lemberg, Brody, all the Jewish cities are now under Stalin, USSR. This is a famous book. If anybody's interested, that's the book to read, from Professor Levin from EBU, called Lesser of Two Evils. He did a very fascinating study of what happened in all these areas that Stalin took over from 39 until Hitler took it all over in 41. That's a different story. And there was the ruthless Sovietization, as you can understand. And I wasn't able to get the thing. I'll do it for the video. You remember the movie Europa, Europa? I don't know if you remember this. That's true. You know, this guy's Jewish. He's running on the other side of the river. The Russians are there. The Polacks are going the other way. They said, the Russians are here. I'm running to the Germans. The Jews are there. I'm running to the Russians. They're looking for the lesser of the two evils. Lesser of the two evils. Now, by the way, not everybody hopped right away what's going on. The Belzer Rebbe and others ran away to the Germans. It took them a little while to figure out that was a mistake. Go back to the Russians. You understand? The Shabina Rebbe was smarter. He realized from day one, it's the Russians. Now, Stalin means you're going to have the secret police, the NKVD, they're going to close anything religious and so on and so forth. In the long run. Meanwhile, the Soviets are busy imposing their regime, and their immediate targets are your Poles and your Ukrainians who don't fit the communist pattern, which is anybody that was a bourgeois or religious or something like that. The Jewish term will come, but it didn't happen so much during this period. And anyway, if you have a half a brain, I wouldn't exactly walk to shul with a tallis under Stalin. It's not a good idea. You see, low profile. Okay? Now, what about the Ukrainian nationalists that are battling Poland? They're not communists, so the NKVD shoots them. You get it? They're crushed by the Stalinist secret police. Judaism is slated to be crushed by the Soviet states. Didn't happen right away. And the Jews, here's where they made a big mistake, but they can't blame them. The Jews find themselves now occupied by the Soviet army. They kiss up to the Soviets. I mean, you try to get along with who you can get along. You get it? If you're Jewish, this is the new future. It's better than Hitler, you see? So what do I got to do to kiss up to the Soviets? Oh, my goodness. What does that do to your Galician neighbors? The Ukrainians. You see? You're a cancer, between cancers, right in our midst. Okay? Same thing happened in Lithuania and other countries as well. And so, it turns out they have this seething situation which is now a cauldron. The OUN, the Ukrainian nationalist terrorist group, persuades itself that Germany is on their side. After all, in 1918, when the Germans won the First World War, they did support the establishment of a large Ukrainian state, which is a smart idea as a buffer against Russia. The Hitler wasn't like that, right? Hitler had other plans. Let's go to the next one. And as we all know, he wanted to kill all the Slavs. So he's not going to make independent Ukraine. During the war, he used them. He did this way, he did that way. Anybody has a half a brain knows if he won the war, and once he finished killing all the Jews, who was number 2 on the list? Your Slavs, your Poles, your Ukrainians, and all the others. You know why? That way you have a giant piece of territory empty. And the Germans can move in and set up farms. And we'll do a better job than these Slavs did and all that kind of stuff. You see? So the Ukrainians at the beginning welcomed the German army when they came in June of 41 with Hitler. But within a little while they realized things aren't so hotsy-totsy as they imagined. Nevertheless, many Ukrainians continued to hope that Hitler would back them. And anyway, he's fighting Stalin, who they hated. And therefore, Hitler was able to form whole divisions in the German army of what they call Western Ukrainians, who are not Polish. See, this is why, if I say this, let me put it this way. Poles get real angry today. Because, there were Poles in the Hitler army, all the rest of it. It was Eastern Galicia. It wasn't Poles, it was the Ukrainians. And Americans said like this, Goldberg, iceberg, it's all the same. To them, the differences are very significant, you see? And this was a Ukrainian phenomenon, okay? Anyway, Hitler busted in right away. He overran the Russians real quickly. Lvov fell. The invasion was June 21, and by June 30, the Germans were already in Lemberg. They occupied the whole eastern Galicia, okay, in 10 days, 12 days. And then, I think we know, what was the fate of the Jews in the territories that were invaded by Hitler in June of 41. It's called the Holocaust by bullets, where they rounded up and shot people en masse. You see? Now, in Eastern Galicia, it was worse, because the Ukrainians themselves did all kind of horrible things. First of all, it was a mass rape. Second of all, they chopped people in half like Khmelnytsky's time. They pulled people apart, bash heads against, all kind of sick sort of things. And even the Germans were like, whoa, you see? I could show you pictures, but I don't feel like, you don't want to see them. It's really sad. You understand? I mean, pregnant, but I don't want to go into it. And now, I want to say this. Not all the Ukrainians, but Ukrainians. I'll be fair about it. There's not everybody at all. But there were plenty. As I say, I don't know if there were many, but there weren't a few. You see? I don't know if it's a majority, but it wasn't a few either. Now, that means that in Lemberg, the numbers speak for themselves. There were 100,000 Jews in Lemberg, and at the end of the war, there were 3,400. That's, 97%, 96%. Okay? And mind you, Lemberg was liberated by the Red Army early in July of 44. That's how the Eastern Front worked. So that means roughly the time of D-Day, that's when the liberation came. And there were if it would be another year, like in Dachau, probably 10 left, You know how that works. Okay? Now, the Ukrainians were Hitler auxiliaries all through the Holocaust. And that's why you have concentration camp guards and shooters and Einsatzgruppe and all this that were Ukrainians. I want to say again, not all, but not few. And many continued it even after their disillusionment with Germany. Because at least, whatever happens, we'll have a Jew-free Ukraine. You see? Now, what about the Poles in Western Galicia? That's a different story. The Poles in Western Galicia were not auxiliaries of Hitler because they weren't offered the chance. Hitler came and started killing all the Poles also from day one. You see? Western Galicia has a place called Auschwitz. That's where it's located. You see? And some of the other camps. Auschwitz is 20 miles from Krakow or something like that. And so there, you didn't have the Holocaust by bullets, but rather in 1942, as we all know, you had the Holocaust by extermination camps. Right? It's a different model, but at the end of the day, they're all dead. So this is how Galicia sadly came to an end. By the time the Russians reconquered everything, by the time the Russians reconquered Ukraine and Poland, there was basically nobody left. I mean, a small number, basically nobody left. In the end, Stalin got it all by 1945. And Stalin, on his own, because he could do what he wanted, he restructured the border and transferred the population. So here is the new Poland. This is the old Poland of 1939. All this territory is annexed to Russia, USSR. So the area you and I call Eastern Galicia, from then on became part of the Ukrainian SSR, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. You understand? So Lvov, or Lviv, was Soviet territory. On the other hand, what Stalin did was, he said, I'll take this part of Germany and give it to Poland as compensation. And he took this part of Germany, there and there, and he broke it off from Germany and said, this is all part of Poland. Now, what do you do with all the Germans there? Kill them or kick them out. Do what you want. And so the result was two things. The borders radically changed. I mean, this is radical plastic surgery over here, for the European borders, like having a sex change. And in addition to that, vast numbers of people were transferred by force from one place to another, whether they liked it or not, and hundreds of thousands died in the process. So the Germans were kicked out of these places very brutally. Well, big deal. They were very brutal to everybody else. Okay? And that means if you're Polish, you have a lot of houses to give away and things like that over here. On the other hand, all the Poles that were here were kicked out by Stalin into Poland. But he said to Poland, now you kick out all the Ukrainians who live here. And now we'll have a black and white situation. Poland is nothing but Poles. Ukraine is nothing but Ukraine. You see what I'm saying? Same thing with Lithuania. And that's why Stalin said, as you see in the next line, everybody should be happy. I gave him an ethnically cleansed country. He couldn't understand why they're not happy with him. You understand? And to tell you the truth, from a very brutal nationalist point of view, you get it. Right? But that's not the way the people experienced Soviet occupation. Right? That's not the way they experienced communist rule. But nevertheless, the Galician Jews don't care about any of this, because by this time they're all dead. At this point, this loses interest in Jewish history, and therefore you and I don't care. I mean, if you're a historian, but most people don't care about the border changes and that stuff in Eastern Europe. What's her name? Anne Applebaum now writes a lot about that and so forth. It happened what happened. And by the way, that's what Rabbi Kahana says. Transfer a population, like kick the Arabs out. I mean, everybody's doing that. It didn't happen once. It happened a bunch of times in Europe. Czechoslovakians kicked out all the Sudeten Germans because they had Czechoslovakians bad. That kind of thing. But we don't care. And so, as I end, I can only say that, as you can gather, I have scratched the surface of this subject and tried to give you a basic framework that you can do reading on your own if you're interested now. If you follow through the 6 talks I did, I try my best to take it from day 1 to the end, because there is an end, a sad end. And Galicia, therefore, was an episode in Jewish history. I didn't have time to go deep in it, but I went for Bekias, as they call it. And if you're interested in anything more than that, then you have to say, as Hillel said to the guy who asked him about Judaism, let's go to the last one. Is this the last one? Well, he didn't put Zeal Gemara. You have to do the reading on your own. But this brings Galicia to an end. And as I said before, I hope you've learned something. With that, I bid you good night.